So since my last video, I've gotten a lot of private messages from people asking if they could swap out the red LED in their mouse with a color changing LED. And the answer is, well, sure you can. The problem is you can't do just a direct swap, and there's a few reasons for that. And I really won't get into that at this point, but it has to do with the changing colors as well as voltage requirements. But as you can see with the mouse in the middle, I've done that with this one, and it looks as though it just had a direct LED swap. It even comes through the bottom like it's the only LED in the case. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I've done that. And using the red mouse, we're going to go through and do that. So the first thing you're going to need is an infrared LED. You can get that out of an old remote control. I found this broken DirecTV remote, and it's kind of nasty. It's been sitting in a basement. And as you can see here, it actually comes with, it has two infrared LEDs in parallel. So we're going to take those out and put those in the mouse. But first, let me show you how I've done this mouse, just as an example. And what I will say while I'm opening this up, it works just fine. And the color changing does not seem to affect the performance whatsoever. Alright, now if you notice inside you have the color changing LED in the back there. Let me zoom in. You see you have that color changing LED in the back. And in front of it, which you can't see because it's invisible light, but there is an infrared LED in the front. And the infrared LED is tied in just like the red LED would be, or blue, whatever color you would normally change it to. And that's the standard LED that would be in the mouse. That is what is illuminating the surface. The color changing LED is what is just giving the effect. Now if you take this out here, the color changing LED is actually running off of the 5-volt line from USB. It's running through a resistor, which then just ties directly into it. So as soon as you plug the mouse into power, it starts to cycle colors. Alright, so let's take this one apart. First thing I'll do is unplug it. I don't want to short out my my USB ports. Alright, first thing we're going to notice, this mouse is a little bit different inside. But that's okay. We'll make do, because every mouse is going to be different. Alright, so the mount, the LED mount, you see this black piece of plastic, we're going to get rid of that. And we're going to hold it in place with hot glue instead. And we're going to unsolder that and take that LED out. We're going to put the infrared LED in its place. Now with this one, I am going to, instead of using one colored or color changing LED, I'm going to use two smaller color changing LEDs. The reason I'm going to do that is because they don't cycle perfectly or I should say they don't cycle perfectly in sync. So you'll have maybe blue on one side, red on the other, and a mixture of colors in between. So here I'm just trying to get this plastic casing off the remote. And we're not saving this remote. This is just a parts remote, so I don't really care what breaks. And just throwing a lot of solder on it just to heat it up so that they drop out the bottom. You can also desolder it if you want to, whatever's easiest. But as you see, heat them up, falls right out. Now, if you don't, you could always order. If you don't have any, you can always order infrared LEDs. There's parts distributors. But it's, if this is going to be a one-time deal for you, The easiest thing is find an old remote. If you don't have any old remotes, go to Goodwill, go to a thrift store, find one. Find a used universal remote. As long as it's an infrared remote, it'll work. Or should work, I should say. Alright, now this piece here has got to fit in that slot. And the infrared LED the LED that's in there has to butt up right against it to be in focus. So when we mount the new LED, it's got to be very similar or very close to what this is. And there's the old red LED. Now, when you take it off, be careful to notice which side of the LED is the cathode and which side is the anode. If you look on the inside of the LED, you'll see a large part and a small part to the LED. It's the best way I can explain it. The large part is the cathode, is the negative. And it's going to sit like that. So when we bend the terminals, we want to make sure we bend them at that place. So that it sits at that angle, or it sits at that location. Here I'm just moving the solder aside so that I expose the holes. You could also use a desoldering gun or solder wick for this, but I was able to do it without that. It just fits right through. And I don't think it's far enough up here, so I have to realign it again. Okay, so that's pretty close. That's pretty much where we want it to be. So if you want, at that point, drop some hot solder on it and hold it in place. I didn't at this point. I just soldered it in place. I'm not hot solder. Hot glue in to drop some hot glue in place. I wound up just soldering it, holding it with my thumb, and then just soldering it. Whatever works best for you. Okay, now that it's actually back in, we're going to test it. We're going to make sure that the infrared LED works, and then it works for this mouse. There are different wavelengths that they can emit, different infrared wavelengths that they can emit, just like there's different colors of blue, different shades of blue, different shades of red. Same thing with infrared. We want to make sure that our optical sensor can actually see what this emits, and that the fact that it emits, that it's bright enough. So we want to make sure it works before we go any further. So you don't have to reassemble the whole thing, just enough to see that it moves, that the mouse pointer moves. So you plug it in. It's not lighting up, obviously, because it's infrared. And I'm testing it, and I can tell you because I'm the one that did it, it did in fact work. It didn't like the mat that it was sitting on, but it did work. Okay, so now these are my LEDs. Now these are my LEDs. And like I said before, I'm not using the larger 5mm. I'm going to use two 3mm LEDs, and that requires two resistors. You want one resistor per LED, and you connect them in parallel. And I'll show you that later. So first thing, I'm just going to throw a dab of hot glue just to keep the infrared LED from moving. Hold it in place till it dries. Now, as far as the color changing LEDs, I'm going to put one on either side, with the cathodes or the negatives in the center. I'm going to twist them together because they're going to get tied to ground. And as you see, I have them hot glued to either side of the infrared LED. I'm just going to solder that here. Clip off the excess. And we're going to run that to ground with a small piece of wire. And the easiest way I found for this was to run the wire through the center of the board. There was a hole there underneath there you go, underneath the LED. However, in your situation, just do whatever works and cut the wire to length. Now what you'll need to do if you're unsure which one ground is, just put the plug back on and you'll see the black wire is going to be ground. So you want to solder it to the pin that corresponds to the black wire. And I actually soldered it to the wrong one, so it's upside down and I messed up. So I had to fix it and solder it to the proper one. Alright, now there's the ground. Now as you see, the red there is in the middle. The red is the 5-volt line. These are usually the colors they use. Green and white are the data. Red and black are, red is positive 5 volts, otherwise known as VCC. Ground is, negative ground. So just tin the resistors. We're going to use, like I said, on the anode, which is the positive side of the LEDs. We're going to use one resistor a piece, or one resistor per side. and then we're going to tie the legs, the other side of the resistors, together. And this is very hard to do when you're bending over a table. Now you want to be careful when you do this not to, obviously you don't want anything that's not supposed to be shorted, shorted. So what I'm going to do later on is, as you notice there, the LEDs run, or I'm sorry, the resistors run past the ground. I'm going to drop a little hot glue there later on just to hold the resistors in place, to make sure they don't move and potentially become shorted. Which they shouldn't, but we'll just make sure. I just want to solder on the other resistor. Just want to solder on the other resistor. And gently bend it around. Clip off the excess. I apologize for it not being in frame. So what I'm doing there is I'm tying, or just twisting the legs, the resistor legs around. Now I'm going to solder them together. And then, okay, so now we're going to take a piece of wire. We're going to solder it to the 5-volt line, which again on our connector was the red wire. It's kind of difficult to do when you can't sit over top of it and look at what you're doing. The camera's in the way. And I'm just going to clip off the excess there. Okay, and then the wire, you solder the wire to the end of the resistor. Once again, clipping off the excess. Okay, now let's plug it in and see how it works. And there we go. Now, I will say, on camera, it looks terrible. In real life, it looks actually very cool. The camera doesn't pick up all the colors, and it just distorts. So now we're pretty much done. We just got to put it back together now. If I can. Oh, here I am. I'm just going to drop a dab of hot glue to hold everything in place. So now that it's back together and finished, the camera is really not picking up the full range and brilliance of the colors, but it does look very cool. And you'll have one color changing on one side and a totally different color on the other side, and you have a rainbow of colors in between. So it's not the same changing effect over and over again. You have almost an infinite amount of colors constantly changing on the mouse, and it's not the same loop over and over and over again. So it does change. It does add a interesting effect to it. So I hope this answered any of your questions, and I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any other questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.